Alan?
Well, excuse me, I've still got a lingering cough, so you have to forgive me if I splutter a wee bit. I'm just hoping that that you can hear me all right. Can you hear me? I can see Taylor. If you can raise your thumb, you're okay. You can hear me fine. Excellent. And as Rachel was saying, I'm going to say a few words about this book, which is the Hunterian Poems, Poems to Paintings in the Hunterian collection. And there's a whole raft and range and diversity of poems and paintings. And I'm going to just read a small selection from the book and say a few things about it, contextualize it. It's a good few years ago, as Rachel said, when Mungo Campbell, the deputy director, and the friends of the Hunterian, in fact, prompted me to think about an anthology of poems, ekphrastic poems, as it's termed, poems which relate to the visual arts, to paintings particularly. And I suggested that instead of, I mean, I'd be very happy to do an entire book of these myself, but it'd be far more interesting to have a range of poets involved and to have a range of different aspects of what poetry is and can do. And that's what we decided upon. So the range includes poems in Scots and Gaelic and English, and includes poems evidently by women as much as men, since women, as has not always been the case, are as published and as good and great a number of different kinds of poets who are women as there are men nowadays. And a kind of sense of the fact that there are different kinds of poem, different ways of approaching what the relationship between the poetic arts and the visual arts can do for each other and can do with each other. There's another background to this, which is just to mention this first poem is by Edwin Morgan, and it's in relation to this painting by Chardin, Lady Taking Tea. And it was initiated by Leslie Duncan, poetry editor at the Herald. And it was an invitation went out to take a poll, to take a survey of readers' favourite paintings in Scotland. Not necessarily Scottish paintings or paintings by Scottish artists, but just favourite paintings in Scotland. And when a number of these came in, they were actually published as a full page article, a supplement, as it were, in the Herald. And a little while after that, Edwin Morgan wrote in to Leslie Duncan and said, I wonder if these will be of any interest to you. And what he had done was to write a poem for every individual painting. Some of them were classic paintings that everybody's familiar with. Brayburn's The Skating Minister, or Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross. Some of them were a little more obscure or unexpected, perhaps. And Edwin Morgan's poem to the Chardin painting is collected in the Hunterian anthology, because the Chardin is here in the Hunterian on permanent view, as are all the paintings we're going to be talking about today. So I'll come back to say a few words about the anthology as a whole, but let me just read this poem and give you a flavour of how it works. So this is Edwin Morgan's poem, Lady Taking Tea. Thank you, but we have seen too many lily white announcements, lily white annunciations. We could flock paper a whole library room with sad Stabat Maters. We could tapestry a flash flood parlour with triumphant assumptions. Can you imagine the relief, the delight, the quiet ovation time has engineered out of simplicity? And do not think she had brought out her silver tea service. Everything was natural, in use, well made. You can see she is not entertaining, but taking a break from her chores. No tablecloth, but nothing scruffy or sloppy. Her striped skirt shows she keeps up appearances. Would no doubt turn the radio on. An artist's wife, as we think she was. Not one for dances or romances. She dreams a moment, staring into the future, where, if she knew it, great art can be an ordinary woman sipping tea. And it's just that Morgan has so much going on in that poem in terms of speculation about ordinariness and everydayness, without protest, without shrillness, without stridency, without violence of any kind. Very delicate, sensitized observation of the painting and everything that the painting might mean in this, as can be conveyed in quite a short poem. Of course, paintings are still, but behind them also is a narrative. And the narrative is drawn out through the verbal arts. Even in a poem itself can be a still object on a page. An imagist poem defines itself absolutely by its immediacy and presence. But a poem which evokes a character or a set of relationships has movement, and that creates narrative. And narrative always creates sympathy of one kind or another. And you've already got that going on in a poem like that. There's a companion poem which Edwin Morgan's successor as the Scots Macher, the poet laureate of Scotland, as it were, responded with, particularly for this volume. Another poem by Chardin, another painting by Chardin, and the poem by Liz Lochhead is called The Scullery Maid Speaks. He liked me fine, the master, called me pretty as a picture. The day he stopped me at my scouring, I was more than a mere scullery maid to him, he said, or rather as something to pay attention to today than a bonny scullery maid like me. He could think of nothing better. He never called me by my name. I think he never knew it, or needed to, nor so much as touched my rough work apron that he said had a coarseness he liked the look of, as so he did my good, clean house frocks, unbleached, nothing sort of colour, that set off nicely the peachness of my skin. That got me blushing, but I needn't have bothered. Looking back, I can see his glad eye was as greedy for copper earthenware, old cooperage, the glimmer in the long-handled pan I worked at. He made every bit as much of that daft cellar boy, who was the bane of my life always, with his crude remarks and grabbing hands, given the half a chance I had to make sure he never got. The master makes him look human, almost handsome, yes. He certainly stands out there in his kitchen whites against the cellar's dimness, beside the old tub among his jugs and flask and funnel. To him we were a pair. Hold still, he said. And that was the only time he ever spoke to me with any hint of sharpness. And I might have said, never mind, Monsieur Chardin, that I've work to be done. The mistress won't be letting me off with, and these pots won't wash themselves, except it wasn't my place to, was it? Besides, squinting at me through those spectacles, dabbing at his canvas, tutting, I could see that he was hard at work. And I liked that. It gave me pause. Again, a very different kind of poem. So Liz Lochhead is taking the point of view and the voice of the scullery maid. And she's really taking a very different way of presenting the experience of the painting than the one Edwin Morgan took in the describing the lady taking tea. And Liz also compares this painting to its companion painting, The Cellar Boy, and puts them as a pair against the lady taking tea that Edwin Morgan concentrated on. So all of these reciprocal relationships, the way the poems slow you down, as Liz Lochhead said, the scullery maid's master was hard at work painting. And when the scullery maid sees him hard at work, that sense of the hard work of art is also part of an industry, a kind of economy of labor, intellectual, physical labor with the delicacy and precision and accuracy of the paintbrush and the paint and the canvas. She, the scullery maid, recognizes immediately, and she says, or Liz Lochhead has her say, that gave me pause. And the poems do that. They pause you, they slow you down, they make you, hopefully, they make you look at the paintings again and come back to them. How often is it that we hear of people going to an art gallery and walking through, and on average, spending a few seconds only at each painting? But if you put the poems alongside them, then the opportunity is to think of the poems and then think of the paintings again. It's a reciprocal relationship. Well, as I say, there's a whole range of very different kinds of poem in the book, just as there are a whole range of very different kinds of painting in Hunterian. We wanted to explore this in as much variety as we could. So the next painting is by D Ferguson, one of the greatest colorists. Ferguson is one of the only, the only artist of that generation, really, who wrote a really major book on modern Scottish painting, which the artist Sandy Moffat, and I edited a few years ago and annotated. It's an astonishing book. In some ways, it reads like a modernist novel, but it's really about the state of Scottish art in the early 1940s, 1943, middle of the Second World War. And this painting we can date to around about 1910, 1912, just before the First World War. And in some respects, I take it to be of huge significance in that era, coming up to through the First World War, past the Easter Rising in Ireland, past the Russian Revolution, into the era of the Hugh McDermott's Scottish Renaissance in literature, poetry, and the arts in the 1920s. It's almost as if this painting foresees the violence that's approaching and offers a kind of antidote, offers a kind of revision, a kind of vision of what health actually is, beyond the violence of war and beyond the bloodshed of revolutions, something that's inherent in human beings. And I love it, this painting, because it's if it's a vision of health, it's also a hugely assertive vision of health. There's nothing apologetic or shy or retiring about this. In fact, we had an idea at one point that if it had been turned into a poster and had been displayed, cool, it's a huge painting. And it's the first thing you see when you go into the Hunterian. So it's a marvelous advertisement for the Hunterian gallery itself. And when you go in through the Paolozzi doors, and this is in front of you, you're challenged. You think, wow, what are we in for here? What are we looking at? So it's a vision, as it were, of the healthy ones, les yeux. Ferguson's title for the painting was apparently invented for the title, created. And this idea of what they're about is a permanent symbol, a redress to violence, a redress to the disposition of warfare. And the idea that it should be turned into a poster and put on display in every church in Scotland, and in every school in Scotland, and in every institution and business in Scotland, and that this would be a great example to anybody who is concerned with anything that was about rule making. Well, there are rules. These people are dancing in formation, and there are rules about the application of paint and the understanding of tone and color, and what foliage is, and what nature is, and how people are in tune with nature in particular ways in a dance. So the poem that goes with it, I wrote called The Dancers, and it really is about that. There's a great poet called George Meredith who called space, who described the idea of heaven as a space for winging tons. The idea that heaven would be so glorious and so vast that tons of weight could dance in it, could be winging their way in it. A space for winging tons, that's heaven. And the foliage around it, of course, people tend to think of Ferguson as a great Francophile. But for my money, those trees and that foliage and those fruits, that's Perthshire. So this is Scotland. This is a vision of Scotland. These people are dancing in a healthy, independent, wonderfully culturally enriched Scotland. The dance is the dancers, the dancers, the dance. Shall we reverse us? The others are then, but now you and I. This foliage Perthshire, not heavy as France, the steps are as light as the virtues are high. Meredith called heaven a space for winging tons. The bodies are weighty as flesh, bone, but buoyant. The air carries all of us, living, the healthy ones. The pattern is movement, secure, yet flamboyant. All sails are set in the best kind of rig, free and well billowing, poised up and big. Each sailor's a captain on watch from the brig, and each movement fine and neat, well placed and trig. Lifting your legs in broad, gamesome turning, like fully charged tumblers, unstoppably tumbling. No slips or spins or stops, no errors or stumbling. All fires aflame and every fire burning. The dancers will fly on the earth, in the sky. Formal and free, in step yet unruly. Godless and sacred, by right in the hoolie. Crooked and straight, sharply angled and bent, hooked and nooked and given and lent, glancing and prancing, well stepped and high leaping, coordination observed, formal in keeping, nothing stale there at all, and no sense of dropping, skip and turn, and once again hopping, bounce and flounce and throw down the gauntlet. Baby, if you've got it, flaunt it. No hesitation distracts from the statement. No doubt will ever create an abatement. They are with us forever, these figures of health. They are Scotland, the image, eternal, the wealth of the senses and mind in the stories and songs they arise from, and the lie of the wrongs of 100 years more since they came to pass. Exile and statelessness, murder in mass since 1913, and all that then followed. The painting unseen, wrapped up, simply swallowed in darkness, while equally so, people die for the lack of what Ferguson shows us, the bounce and great swack of their dancing. All story, life and pattern and song stays with them and turns them and counter-turns, long as the ages. Their health is ideal. What Ferguson says, though, is this is for real. It's that sense of it being a wonderful, a permanent statement of health and joy. Never more needed. And the sadness of it is that since then it stayed in Ferguson's archive and wasn't seen again from 1913 through till 1960. Or the 1960s. It was really, I think he must have judged it a little bit too much for Scotland at that time. Well, goodness knows we've come a long way since then. Maybe not far enough, but we're on the way. Well, the Hunterian at the moment is running an exhibition of paintings by Joan Eardley. And we'll move towards a conclusion with a few poems that relate to some of the paintings in the Joan Eardley collection. So first we're going to have a wee poem called Salmon Nets and the Sea from one of Eardley's great Catherland paintings. Jerry Fellows, great, terrific poet, has this, and again, a very different kind of poem. Remember we had the Edwin Morgan's observational poem, Liz Lochhead's almost ventriloquized monologue poem, my own dancing, kind of imitative, but also festive celebration. It's a different kind of poem again, from Jerry Fellows. A trailer, tipped up, identifier, by nets stretched to black frames, lit vermilion. a yellow flicker out of browns wheeling into gunmetal, as gulls might do, inhabiting a band of foam and grit, a hurled, transforming density of being. The nets are lines flying across the field of vision into the creamy spill and drip of ocean, sucked back to a blue deeper than translucence. Petrol, and the sky oily dark, and the wheeling invisible gulls, yet nothing of steel in the lowering spray, the flung moisture I stand in, cut by particles of the minute, invisible and indivisible, self-dispersed and coalescing, a bodily coherence in the grit and oil of matter. It's almost as if Jerry has entered into the substance and material of the painting, starting with the trailer on its side tipped up, something you can identify there, but almost everything borders on abstraction. And the only things you can rely upon are the grit and the oil and the granular existence of what matters, what matter is in these minutiae, these minute details, so that you can almost see the invisible gulls in the sky and the energy that's behind that, the energy that comes through it. And it's that quality of energy, I think, that carries through in the last two poems I'll read. This next one is by Edwin Morgan, and it turns to Joan Eardley's other great subject, the children. Eardley in the Sweet Shop, Rotten Row. It's quite an early poem of Edwin Morgan's from his first book, first major publication, first breakthrough book of poems called The Second Life in 1968. Morgan owned this painting and kept it with him. When he was growing elderly and more frail, he went to live in a care home. He took this painting with him. It's very small painting, packed with intensity, packed with color, explosive with energy. And when he died, before he died, he bequeathed his collection of paintings to the Hunterian. So this is now in the collection. But again, I think the poem does exactly what I've been describing. It slows you down, it takes you into the painting, and it comes back out with a very particular relationship established between the verbal arts, the visual arts, and the energy of life. What's there, I hope, in the poem I wrote, that what's there in Ferguson's painting for sure, what's there in different ways through all the different approaches and extractions from the poem, from the paintings that the poems deliver. Excuse me. So, Eddie's poem to Joan Eardley. Pale yellow letters, humbly straggling across the once brilliant red of a broken shop face. Confectio. And a blur of children at their games passing, gazing as they pass at the blur of sweets in the dingy, cosy, Rotten Row window. And Eardley on my wall. Such rags and streaks that master us, that fix what the pick and bulldozer have crumbled to a dingier dust. The living blur fiercely guarding energy that has vanished. Cries filling still the unechoing close. I wandered by the rubble, and the houses left standing kept a chill dying life in their islands of stone. No window opened as the coal cart rolled, and the coal man's call fell coldly to the ground. But the shrill children jump on my wall. It's an astonishing poem, I think, for that transference of energy that must have been there in those kids at that time in the early 60s or 50s, whenever it was that that energy comes from, that those children come from, that particular shop had been active in, transferred through from a living energy to something captured in a painting, and transferred from there through to Morgan's poem, and from there to us. Such a privilege to have it, to think of it that way, to be enlivened by it, to be made sensitive by it. Well, I'll come to a close with, there are two more early paintings that are in the exhibition, but they're not in the anthology. But as it happens, another anthology is due to be published. I think there are two copies, two volumes, and the first one, I think, has just come out. The second one is due to come out shortly, and hopefully we will have an event live in person at the Hunterian celebrating this, to launch the book on, and I think I've got the date right, but Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong, Friday the 6th of May, from 3 o'clock till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll be having a little event there in the art gallery. The two paintings from the exhibition, I'm not sure if you have these, Rachel, but one is first of all, we have the children again, and the last one that we'll come to in a moment takes us back to the sea at Catterley. And the poem I'll read is my own for this particular exhibition, for these aspects of Eardley's work and for this new anthology. And it brings together both aspects of Eardley's work. And it also brings together Eardley with another artist, this time not in the visual arts, but in music. And it's a man called Ronald Center. Let me give you this recommendation. And if you'd like to do some homework, please do it with my greatest blessing and best hopes. Ronald Center, C-E-N-T-E-R. Ronald Center is a great composer and a very neglected composer. And it's only recently that his music has become available to purchase on CD. And you can get copies now of his piano music and of his string quartets. Ronald Center is a great Scottish composer from the Northeast. And he knew Joan Eardley, and he visited Eardley's studio. And as you'll hear in the poem in a moment. And in some respects, some of his music is very close to what Eardley does in her paintings. He has a wonderful piece of for piano called Children at Play. And if you listen to that piece of music, it closes in on exactly the images that you can have in your mind from Joan's paintings. And he has a wonderful series of string quartets, and some of them are extremely difficult and challenging, but they're only as difficult and challenging as Eardley's paintings of the sea at Catherlin, and what Catherlin meant to her, and the energies that are there. And I don't know if anybody today was fortunate enough to go to the exhibitions in Edinburgh a few years ago. Joan Eardley, of course, painted right up to the end, and towards the very end of her life, she was painting even the flowers in the jar by her bedside. So that's the reference at the end of this poem. So I'll just read the poem. We'll go about halfway through. We'll go from here to the seascapes, or to the seascape.
Alan, sorry, can I be a pest? Can you please just remind me of the 3 words that I changed the slide on to go to the next image?
Yeah, it's when I come to the line that goes abstractions in proximity in air.
Fantastic.
And then it goes to that which lives within, and then that's us moving into the seaside.
Excellent. Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Poem is just called Joan in the Tide for Joan Eardley and Ronald Center. Children at play. The piano is their instrument. Single notes, so light and quick, but hammer them, they make a lot of noise. The games are all of rising into what all nature does, at different speeds and shapes, at different rates of growth, connected from their single sources, coupled junctions, heading towards their single destinations. Games and play to help devise both structures and dynamics of such power, from poverty for fun and force to frolic in or flee from, fiercely guarding all that might be easily hurt or burned or broken. The children in the tenements of Glasgow, at Peaver, chanting, skipping, jumps, school bells, scatter, fights and thumps, mind the bairn, give me the lipstick, suddenly the prospect, bicycle bells, push chairs, a moment packed with promises, memories of comfort, dreams of long ago, the nursery, the nestling in, the nestlings out, the feather flutter faces turning outwards, still defiant. A circus-bright exuberance and all the skills of stealth, wild and asking questions, eating stones and coals, playing with what's lively, that means fire. The flame that lives in scraps of grass and rags, newspaper ribbons, tatters of the elements, straw, salt spray, a handful of earth, abstractions in proximity, in air. And that which lives within, such burning strength to generate, to live by earth and sea, which know no human tenderness or vulnerable flesh other than to swallow them across the generations. Joan Eardley possessed such power of utter withdrawal as those the Northeast live by need, the necessary cave, the cradle of reserve, for scrutiny and measurement and judgment, from which expression comes the life of art. As Ronald Centre, Huntley's silent witness making music in his mind and writing of that power in depth and structure, as in his Northeast world, as hers, so finding kinship with her, noting it, holding back from saying it, but letting it be heard, if you can listen. Centre's elegy for Joan Eardley is lost. The great painter died aged 42 on the 16th of August, 1963. Centre and his wife once visited her studio at Catherton on the edge of the coast of Kincardineshire. And Evelyn, his wife, said later, for the meagre sum of £30, he could have acquired one of her now famous pictures, but did not. Eardley's work appealed to Centre deeply. Her paintings are his music, his visual correlative, humanity's compassion there. Those Glasgow kids were there, that warmth within the cottages, skyline, cold on Catherton, and looking out from headland to that dark approaching world, the impersonal weight of sky and sea. What are those granite harmonies at the end of the third quartet? What but the crushing end? There's no escaping wildness in this nature. The scherzo and finale of the first quartet is energy made fierce. Lightning storms and blackening clouds reforming. Listen now, and listen again. That's Catherton. That's winter 3. That's January flow tide. That's what Eardley lets us see, what Centre lets us hear. See the winter, 1, another, 3. What all children grow to then become and enter into, if fortune and goodwill permit them. And every date and number brings another imposition, until the flowers in the jar by the hospital bed say all they can of living, what love is. Well, that's enough from me. The book itself, the Hunterian Poems anthology, I recommend again. It's available from the Hunterian for purchase. And that poem that I've just read will be in the next one, which we'll be launching, as I said, in May. I think I'll pause now because I'm beginning to feel my throat dry up. I'm happy to take questions if anybody's got any questions, or I'll leave that to Rachel to